She's failing again! The instructor's voice roared across the training ground, laughter erupting from the crowd. The brown-haired woman, small frame trembling, collapsed to her knees for the 5th time. Sand caked her chin and uniform. "Just a medic trying to play soldier!" someone shouted mockingly. Heat waves shimmered across the shooting range, sweat blurring her vision. Suddenly, a SEAL commander's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "Breathe!" One word. Nobody knew why, but from that moment, everything changed completely. Her name was Elena Marquez, 27 years old. Long brown hair pulled back tight, small frame that seemed to disappear among the muscled soldiers. Former field medic who'd served in forward combat hospitals. Since joining the training program, she'd been constantly dismissed. On the obstacle course, every time she crawled under barbed wire, sprinted through barriers, or fired weapons, Elena finished dead last. The other soldiers looked at her like an outsider, a medic who'd wandered into the playground of elite warriors. "She belongs in a hospital, not on a training ground," came the whispered insults, dripping with contempt. Elena never argued back. Each evening, she sat alone on the grass, cleaning sand from her boots, eyes silent and distant. The humiliation of being left behind by teammates burned constantly, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. During rifle training, she missed every target. Her shots scattered wide, nowhere near the bullseye. The instructor shook his head in disgust. "Maybe you should quit while you're ahead," he suggested loudly, making sure everyone could hear. The other trainees snickered. Some called out suggestions. Medics should stick to bandages. This is a battlefield, not a first aid station. Elena stood there silently, gripping her M4 rifle, staring at the target through waves of heat rising from the concrete. That evening, she was removed from the main training formation. The entire camp buzzed with gossip. "She'll be washed out soon." But Elena didn't give up. While others slept, she practiced alone. Push-ups until her arms shook, running laps around the empty training ground, dry-firing her weapon until her trigger finger moved automatically. Nobody saw these private struggles. They only saw her public failures. What they didn't know was that Elena carried a different kind of strength. In field hospitals, she'd performed surgery under artillery bombardment. She'd saved lives while mortars exploded around her tent. She knew how to work under pressure. She just hadn't figured out how to translate that calm into combat training. The other soldiers dismissed her as weak, but weakness wasn't Elena's problem. Her problem was overthinking, overcompensating, trying too hard to prove herself instead of simply performing. A private would later recall, "I once saw Elena give her entire water ration to a recruit who'd collapsed from heat exhaustion. She'd rather suffer thirst than watch someone else fall." But nobody mentioned that kind of strength on the training ground. Elena possessed the heart of a warrior. She just needed to remember how to breathe. The shooting drill that day was a disaster. Elena missed every single target. Her bullets went everywhere except where they were supposed to go. "You should just quit now," the instructor shouted. "Save everyone the embarrassment." A group of soldiers laughed openly. Someone called out, "Medics should stick to what they know. This is real soldier work." Elena stood silently, hands tightening around her M4, staring at the target through shimmering heat waves. Sweat dripped from her forehead, mixing with the dust on her uniform. That evening, she was officially removed from the primary training roster. The entire camp whispered, "She'll be gone by the end of the week." But as Elena sat alone by the barracks, the camp radio crackled with a recorded training session. A SEAL commander's voice cut through the static. "Breathe. Just one word, and everything changes." Elena closed her eyes, trying to understand. She breathed in slowly, held it, then released. In her subconscious, memories surfaced of battlefield surgeries where every second counted, where survival depended on maintaining calm under fire. From that moment, Elena applied breathe to every drill. When crawling under barbed wire, instead of rushing frantically, she breathed steadily and moved with purpose. When firing her weapon, instead of tensing up, she controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger during natural respiratory pauses. Gradually, her results began improving. She wasn't excelling, but she was no longer failing completely. The transformation was subtle at first. During morning PT, Elena's movements became more controlled. Her breathing remained steady even during exhausting exercises. On the shooting range, she closed her eyes before each shot, took 3 deep breaths, and fired during the natural pause between inhale and exhale. Her first shot hit the outer ring of the target. The instructor looked surprised. Her second shot moved closer to center. By her 10th shot, she was hitting the bullseye consistently. "Where did that come from?" another trainee whispered. Elena didn't answer. She was too focused on breathing, on letting her body remember what her mind had been overcomplicating. During obstacle course runs, she stopped trying to match the speed of larger, stronger soldiers. Instead, she found her own rhythm, breathing steadily, conserving energy for when it mattered most. The other trainees began noticing the change. The woman who'd been failing everything was suddenly completing drills with quiet competence. "She's different now," one soldier observed. "Calmer, more focused." Elena's improvement wasn't dramatic or flashy. It was steady, professional, reliable. The kind of improvement that came from understanding yourself instead of fighting yourself. But questions remained. Where had this sudden composure come from? How had one word changed everything so completely? A teammate who'd been watching carefully would later recount, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing." The small woman who used to collapse under pressure was now calmly completing the shooting course. I watched her close her eyes, breathe in, and fire perfect shots. From that day, I never laughed at Elena again. The instructor who'd been harshest with her began paying closer attention. There was something different about her technique now, something that suggested more experience than her file indicated. Elena's breathing wasn't just about relaxation. It was about accessing muscle memory from somewhere else, some other time when breathing meant the difference between life and death. The question wasn't just how she'd improved so quickly. The question was, what had she been through before that made controlled breathing feel so natural? During an emergency simulation drill, the training team was ambushed. Explosions, smoke, teammates falling with simulated wounds. Elena's reaction was immediate and instinctive. She sprinted toward the casualties, blood simulant staining her uniform, but her movements were precise, professional, exactly like real combat situations. The instructor watched her work and frowned. "Where did you learn those techniques?" Elena remained silent, continuing to apply pressure bandages and stabilize wounded soldiers. That's when a senior SEAL officer stepped forward, throwing a file folder at Elena's feet. Inside were photographs of Elena in Fallujah, bent over a wounded officer in the middle of a firefight. Artillery explosions in the background, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness. The caption read, "Combat Medic, served in highest casualty situations." The entire training ground fell silent. The woman they'd mocked as just a medic was someone who'd risked her life in the most dangerous combat zones. Elena didn't boast or make excuses. She simply said quietly, I wasn't failing here because I'm weak. I was failing because I forgot how to breathe. Her words silenced the entire training field. The story came out in pieces. Elena had served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. She'd performed surgery in field hospitals while under direct enemy fire. She'd saved dozens of soldiers' lives in situations where most people would have panicked. In Fallujah, she continued, when mortars were falling around our aid station, breathing was the only thing that kept me steady enough to operate. One shaky breath meant someone died. The instructor who'd been hardest on her stared in shock. Why didn't you tell us? Because this isn't about what I used to do, Elena replied. It's about learning to do something new. But her combat experience explained everything. Why she'd struggled initially. She was overthinking civilian training when she was used to life-or-death situations. Why breathe had unlocked her potential. It connected her back to the calm competence she'd developed under fire. A veteran SEAL stepped forward. Ma'am, I was in Ramadi in 2006. You operated on my team leader when our aid station was overrun. You kept working while insurgents were shooting through the tent walls. Elena looked at him with tired recognition. Sergeant Martinez, you held the IV bag while I removed shrapnel from your lieutenant's chest. You saved his life. You saved all our lives that night. The training ground was dead quiet. Everyone understood now. They hadn't been watching a medic try to become a soldier. They'd been watching a combat veteran remember who she was. Elena's failures hadn't been about capability. They'd been about disconnection from her own experience. The pressure of trying to prove herself in a new environment had made her forget the skills she'd already mastered. When I heard that commander say, breathe, Elena explained, it reminded me of something my first combat supervisor told me. In war, the person who breathes calmly lives. The person who panics dies. She'd spent months trying to become someone new instead of applying what she already knew. I thought I needed to be a different person here, she continued, but breathing reminded me that I just needed to be myself. The revelation changed everything. Elena wasn't a failed trainee. She was an experienced combat veteran who'd temporarily lost confidence in her own abilities. The same instructor who'd told her to quit now looked at her with respect. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Elena shook her head. You were doing your job. I was the one who forgot mine. But there was more to it than that. Elena had been trying so hard to fit into a new role that she'd abandoned the qualities that made her exceptional. One word, breathe, had reconnected her to her true self. The small woman who'd been failing every drill was actually a decorated combat veteran who'd forgotten her own strength. Sometimes the problem isn't that we're not good enough. Sometimes the problem is that we forget how good we already are. From that day forward, everything changed in how people saw Elena. The soldiers who'd mocked her began quietly asking for advice. How to stay calm under pressure. How to breathe properly during weapons training. How to maintain focus when everything was falling apart. Elena didn't become an instructor or show off. She simply shared what she knew. Breathe. One word. You'll see the difference. During the next group exercise, the training ground witnessed something remarkable. An entire SEAL team practicing breathing techniques together, inhaling deeply, holding, then executing their drills in perfect synchronization. The instructor who'd once shouted at Elena now bowed his head respectfully. You're the reason they're succeeding. Elena's transformation had transformed everyone around her. She'd shown them that strength wasn't about never failing. It was about remembering who you are when failure tries to define you. Young trainees began seeking her out during off hours. Not for combat stories or war tales, but for something more fundamental: how to stay centered when everything was chaos. "Ma'am," one recruit asked, "how do you stay so calm?" Elena smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in weeks. "I remember that I've been through worse, and I breathe." The training base had learned an important lesson about assumptions and second chances. The person failing today might be exactly the mentor you need tomorrow. Elena continued her training, but now she moved with quiet confidence. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was just being herself. Her shooting scores climbed to expert level. Her obstacle course times became competitive. Her leadership during team exercises was natural and effective. But more importantly, she'd helped create a culture where people supported each other instead of tearing each other down. The base commander issued new guidelines. Before judging someone's potential, remember that you might be watching a hero who's temporarily lost their way. One evening, as Elena cleaned her rifle after a perfect score on the range, a young soldier approached her. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you. Before you got here, I thought I was going to wash out. But watching you come back from failure, it taught me that giving up isn't the answer." Elena looked at him, this kid who couldn't be older than 20, and saw herself months earlier. "Remember to breathe," she told him. "Everything else will follow." Type, "I will live kindly," if you believe that sometimes one simple word can change someone's entire life. Elena's story isn't just about military training. It's proof that a person's true value isn't found in first impressions, but in their ability to stay calm under pressure and remember who they really are. We often judge others too quickly, forgetting that behind every struggling exterior might be a past full of courage and competence. A simple word like breathe can be the lifeline that pulls someone from the depths of failure. It can be a survival secret on battlefields and in daily life. The power of proper breathing extends beyond combat. In job interviews, difficult conversations, moments of crisis. Controlled breathing can mean the difference between panic and performance. Elena's transformation reminds us that sometimes people don't need lectures or criticism. They need a simple reminder to return to their foundation. If tomorrow you meet someone who's falling apart, remember, they might not need your judgment or your pity. They might just need one word that reconnects them to their strength. Sometimes the most powerful help we can offer is the simplest. Sometimes changing a life is as easy as reminding someone to breathe. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.